I want to say thanks, first of all, to everybody who's here. And we'll explain really briefly what we're doing here tonight. This is our first installment of what we hope will be, well, we're planning for twice a week. And Michelle and Chris and I are actually kicking around the idea of like a little more free-form happy hour, maybe with ignoring Rule G on Saturday. So watch the Facebook page for that. But this is just another way that we felt we could support the train enthusiast community, particularly now when we can't be getting together in person. And we're doing it by this medium, which is Zoom. Maybe new to some of y'all. It won't be after a little while, because this is my fourth Zoom call today, and we're all kind of learning how to live on Zoom. Our huddle tomorrow morning is going to be on Zoom at 9 o'clock. So doing this, we have meetings scheduled through the end of the year, Tuesday, Thursday evenings at 6:30 to 7:30. So join us. Same Zoom link for all the shows. The format is going to be interview for the first 30, 35 minutes, maybe 40 minutes, and then Q&A. Now your questions, if you take your cursor and you go down towards the bottom of the screen, a little bar will pop up down there, and there's a little bubble there that says chat. You check that chat bubble and you can type anything you want. Now I would ask that we respect a few ground rules. I would ask that we're here to connect with fellow train enthusiasts. So be respectful, no trolling, no grandstanding or inappropriate comments, and let's leave politics out of this. We're just here to enjoy each other's company and enjoy trains. We're recording these shows. We intend to post them on the Caboose YouTube page, and we'll have links to that all the way around. And let's see what else. Let's see if I've forgotten anything. I think that's pretty much it. Let's just, we're open to suggestions. If you have any other ideas about topics or about our non-rule G happy hour or whatever, we're all ears, and you can use the chat, or you can just email me at kevin@mycaboose.com. So tonight we have with us prolific modeler and author Lance Mindheim of the Shelf Layout Company. Lance, welcome, and thank you for joining us on OS tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Tell you what, I'm going to have to bear with me just a second here. I'm going to have to, because what happens is I'm going to, bear with me just a second. Whenever one of us speaks up or we have noise on one of our lines, unfortunately, they appear in our screen as opposed to Lance. So I want to make sure that we have Lance in here. There we go. Okay. So Lance, it's all yours.
Oh, I thought you were going to ask me a question.
You know what? I am going to ask you a question. What am I saying? It's all yours. So thank you for joining us on OS tonight. We appreciate that. Lance, we'd like to start out, as we talked about the other day, we'd like to start out by learning.
You do not want me to go free range on you, Kevin.
Yeah, I'm just throwing you a curveball there.
Keep me between the rails.
Right? I'd like to start out tonight by learning a little bit more about you, and particularly your passion for trains, which is our buzzword here at Caboose, and one that we really like to talk about. So tell us a little bit about your passion for trains and where that came from.
I've been thinking a lot about that, and we were talking about it a little bit before we went on air in terms of our experiences with the Monon, and I've really been trying to drill down where all this comes from. And I don't know that it's necessarily from a specific railroad experience. And I just think for some of us, I was looking at a Facebook picture from a friend of mine whose 7 or 8-year-old grandson was just so intent on re-railing these N-scale cars. I'm like, this is tied into our DNA. It's not, I think some people are just born with it.
Genetic defect.
Yeah, genetic defect, but just the love of miniatures. And I was also thinking more about this. I'm trying to put a potential column together on this. Not to get too touchy-feely, but I don't really know that what we do is a hobby, because I think it goes much deeper than that in terms of the appreciation we have for the subject. And it's not just railroads. I think it's the rail environment, everything that it comes in. It's not, it just seems to me it goes much deeper than mere recreation for all of us. And to answer your question, I think I was born with it. I think we all were. And all it takes was a little bit of exposure. I talked about when I was 7 or 8 and the Monon went behind my house. And if it wasn't that, it would have been something else. There was a Boy Scout jamboree at our high school, and there was a miniature circus. And I was just so mesmerized by that compared to other people. And so you just take that, and all it takes is one little spark. I was interested in trains in high school, and I came back to Bloomington, and it turned out that some of my best friends had really gone off the cliff too. And there was a very just a very involved railroad club there with you had mentioned the Dolzos. I don't know if you knew Ron Potch, Richard Koenig, Scott Stewart, and we were just at it every week. So I mean, it was just a very nurturing environment. So there is a matter of luck involved if you get in the right little groups that can kind of pick you up and lift you along at the right times. And I got into DC, I hit another one of those. So it's a long-winded way of saying I think it was always in my DNA, and I was lucky enough to always meet the right people at the right time to kind of move me along on the journey.
Sure. Yeah, and always falling into bad crowds, right?
I found them all.
Yeah, right. So, it's interesting you mentioned that, because as a kid, as I mentioned before we started rolling, that I had one of my sets of grandparents. Both sets lived in Northwest Indiana, and one lived in Hammond, and of course, pretty close to the Monon Yard. And I would during the summers we'd stay with our grandparents, and my grandmother at one point took me to the couple times, I'm sure, took me to the public library, and I came across a book. I'm going to show you here, a book by Frank Ellison. This book was published in 1954, so, and I'm not that old. It was an old book when I first read it. But this is Frank Ellison on model railroaders. If you've been around the model railroad hobby for any period of time, or you're a train enthusiast of any stripe, you probably know the name Frank Ellison, because he and his Delta lines, his O-scale Delta lines down in New Orleans, were really seminal in shifting us from train sets and tin plate and playing with the trains, on the living room floor or whatever, to operations, and to realistic scenery, and to modeling railroads as a model railroad. I read that book from cover to cover, and I was absolutely intrigued, because I was just eating all of it up about track structure and operations and scenery and bench work and things like that. So I think Ellison was very, very influential. And I just recently, as we've discussed earlier, just recently read, and I'll share my screen here, just recently finished reading your book. I think it was published in 2018, right?
Right. I tried to get out for Christmas, so it's about a little over a year old.
Yeah, Model Railroading is Art. And of course, I think, as we talked about the other day, that's the same photo as just appeared in Trackside Photos, right? This cover shot.
It's the same photo. I spliced a different sky in, but yeah, it's the same shot.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, that's I feel that that this book is as seminal and as game changing as Frank's book was back in and Frank, this book, by the way, I should say, came out of a series in Model Railroader in 1944 called The Art of Model Railroading. It was about a 5 or 6 part series. And I think that we're looking at a different shift in, from back then, from tin plate and train sets to models of railroads, to today with, and particularly with your book, to viewing the model railroad as a canvas. That's the way I like to express it, and as an outlet for creative expression. And so, and that's a lot of what your book's about, essentially. And so, if you wouldn't mind, tell us a little bit about, the artistic principles that are in place in the book, and when you design and help build model railroads for others, and how we might be able to apply some of those. And maybe, if you don't mind, if you have an opportunity to give us an example from the layouts. I don't know if you're in the studio or not, but from the layouts that you have there,
Sure.
that'd be great too.
Well, I think the whole thing kind of, goes back a little bit further, that not just myself, but everybody I come in contact, it goes back to what I was talking to a while back. And it's like, what is this all about? Because it's not really recreation, not the point, put down the boulders or whatever, but there's something else going on with this. And there's just something about the rail environment. We can all laugh that, we can go to an industrial park with the weeds growing between the track and the rust, and be just totally mesmerized. And everybody would walk by us and goes, "What is wrong with you guys?"
That's exactly.
But really, what it comes down to is, I think it's an appreciation just for the moods, the textures, the same thing that a painter would pick up on. And I think that's part of what pulls us in. It's not just the machinery and the trains in motion and the rail lore, which is a part of it. So I think what's drawing us in is the same thing that would pull an artist in. And when we look at our work, really, I think the same thing is going on in our mind as would be a painter or, say, a filmmaker. So when you drill into it and step back and look at it that way, then the same principles that apply to painting or film, maybe sculpture, but I would say painting and film are probably the two closest. Then that opens up a whole new world, because both of those fields have been studied and perfected, for centuries or decades by, very talented artists. So if we can go back and take the principles that they use and apply them to our medium, we don't have to recreate the wheel. And going back and look at it, I don't know if you remember, you can help me out with the pronunciation of his name, but do you remember the old Rail Model Journal? They had a weathering contest, and the rule was you had to have a blue box Athearn auto rack with all cast on details, cast on everything. They were pretty crude. But is it Mike Budd or Buddy? I can never remember.
Oh, Chris knows. It's Buddy, isn't it? Right, Chris? Let me unmute Chris. I think I've got him in mute jail.
It's Mike Buddy.
Yeah, Buddy. Yeah.
So I remember that Mike won that. And the thing that really jumped out at me is these are these pretty crude models, and yet perfectly weathered. They just blew your mind. So that told me at that point, I said, what is going on here? It's not so much the prototypical accuracy, it was the color treatment. And then you look at other modelers, Paul Dokos, for example, Tom Johnson, some guys that just model with mock-ups, just have such astounding models. And you say, what's going on there? Why could just a collection of gray illustration board mock-ups be so convincing, like David Barrow, who's an architect?
Yes.
It's the composition. So from that, and it's really kind of the foundation of the book, is that a really well done layout isn't so much about prototypical accuracy. And I have to be careful, I'm not diminishing that. But what the eye picks up on isn't so much whether a window has 6 mullions or 8 mullions. It's really the color treatment, the quality level of a Mike Buddy, a Gary Christensen, guys like that. And then of equal value would be the composition, what elements we put in the scene, the size, and the spacing. And if we focus on those two areas, we can improve what we're looking at. And it's really kind of an individual hobby. For the most part, nobody cares that much. We go to our basement, we're the one that sees it more than anybody else. And the more that we can improve the experience for ourselves, I think the more enjoyable the hobby will be. But if we don't know what's driving things, we can put our efforts in the wrong area.
It seems to me that of those two primary tenets, that we're a little bit down the road on color. Pardon me, like we picked that up several years ago, even to the point to where the manufacturers, I mean Athearn's the example I think of here, are doing prime for grime, to where they're actually, the paint they're applying on a DT&I locomotive is not really DT&I orange, it's faded DT&I orange. And then they have the patches, and then they're ready to weather. Whereas there was a time when we would have not considered the patina of a paint scheme. So it seems like we're a little bit down the road there. And with what you've done, I remember the article on your Los Angeles Junction CF7 locomotive. And I just thought that the weathering you did on that was amazing, and is a level of magnitude beyond what's going on right now and what's coming up, like through the railroad prototype modelers meets. But then when we talk about composition, that really grabbed me when I was reading the book, because you noted that there's sometimes a tendency for us to have all really ornate structures, for example, that are all like, perhaps they're award-winning structures, and yet you wouldn't necessarily see that in life, which I guess could be a benefit for someone who is a prototype modeler, because they're modeling the exact structures that are there and not just picking out I don't know how to say it, the more flashy ones, the more what I call a keystone structure. So
Right.
Address that for a bit. Oh, and I want to say, by the way, I want to let everybody know that don't forget that chat bubble down at the bottom. If you have any questions, ask them at any time. And Michelle's paying attention, I think. Are you paying attention to those questions? She's paying attention to those questions. If you have any questions for Lance or any of us, just type them in at any time in that chat bubble down below. Sorry, Lance, go ahead.
Well, just going to back up for a second. And one thing I've noticed in our hobby is, and you had talked about the freight cars, is the freight cars have always been light years ahead of every other aspect of the hobby in terms of detail level, just evolution, skill, everything, weathering. But there's more to the scene than the cars. And I think other areas need to catch up with that in terms of the scenery colors, structure colors. If the rest of the elements could catch up with the freight cars, I mean, everything we do would be mind-blowing, but it continues to be the freight cars that are so much farther ahead. And part of it is a little bit easier to control. Maybe we just have smarter people in the freight car industry, I don't know. But I agree with everything you said on the freight cars, but I would say that the other elements have a long way to go to get to the same level that the rolling stock is. Mm-hmm. So I would say that. Then getting to the composition, one of my longtime friends and mentors is a guy named Chuck Hitchcock out in Kansas City. Yep. And I remember watching a video that was so darn old, it was when Chuck actually had black hair. And he said, the key to realism is to not only feature the ordinary, but to almost exaggerate it. And we have some artistic latitude. And if you take a given scene, you can almost make it more realistic by making it more ordinary than it actually is. But when you view the elements as the star and a supporting cast, if everything is a standout element, then it kind of gets lost in the noise, as opposed to if you have supporting elements and then one accent piece, then they all work together.
So perhaps you could give us some examples from your HO or N scale layouts there.
I'm going to try to walk around and see if, tell me if you can see this as we go. So, can you see?
Yes.
The layout? So this is an example of the LA junction, and as you'll see, you'll notice, I can't see what I'm pointing at, so Kevin, yell at me if it's not, but.
No, that's good right there. That looks good right there.
So as you look at the warehouses, you'll see that they're all a very muted gray and off-white. And then as you come down to the end, then you have the signature structure, which is Mayburn Liquors, which you'll notice is a little bit brighter color. And if the other structures had
just tilt your camera down just a little. There you go. There you go. Awesome.
So if the other structures had been the same color, this would have gotten lost in the noise. So there's two ways that you can highlight an element. One is through color, which this stands out because it's a little bit brighter than the others. Another is by size, which doesn't apply here. And then a third way is by position. You can see that it's on the corner of the layout in a more prominent location. Mm. So that's just an example of that point.
Nice.
So,
nice.
And one thing that I wanted to mention is when I was writing the book, I got about halfway through it and I realized that I was really over my head. There were a lot of areas I didn't really understand, and I'm fortunate in terms of art concepts. And I'm fortunate by living in Washington, D.C., they have this amazing organization called Smithsonian Associates, which is basically a college in the basement of the Smithsonian. And I took 6 months just to enroll in some of their courses, and none of them were how to paint, how to draw. They were all theory. Visual literacy, composition, color theory, and these guys were just amazing. I mean, they brought university professors in from George Mason, you know, all the surrounding colleges, and I mean, they just brought things to a whole new level. And the thing that was funny is I was in the composition course, and I had a picture of the layout I just showed you. And I went up to the instructor and I said, you know, something's missing with, I just feel like something's off. And can you look at this? And he said, well, I'm a painter. I don't know, but let me see what you got. He goes, oh, yeah. And he goes, you need a splash of color here. You need several vertical elements here to offset this. And he just, like, in 30 seconds, just broke the whole thing down and just totally blew my mind. But
is that the example where you end up putting a sign on the corner of one of the buildings, like a for lease sign or something like that?
Yes.
Is that extent?
Yeah, that was his idea. He said you need just something small with color there.
Yeah.
And then he was talking about the palms. You need more vertical. You need more vertical elements. So, but it really illustrated the point is that we're really, if we accept the fact that what we do is art, then that opens up the whole new world to bring in people that can really elevate our work. I don't think it's any different. And the art world just has so much to offer in terms of helping us.
Yes.
And what I would encourage people is to really focus more on the theory and the concepts than necessarily how to paint or how to draw. Those are the courses that really help me the most, and they're not very expensive. You're looking at $50 for an all-day class.
Right.
It's not that much. And you know, if you come to Washington once we reopen, you could have a vacation around one of these classes. That would be really enjoyable. But anybody that lives near a university would have access to these classes.
Sure, of course. Another one of the elements that I perceive to be an element of composition that you mentioned in your book that I was fascinated with was also balance. Just visual balance, and how you can achieve that different ways. I thought that was, and obviously, I don't want us to to give the whole book away because there's no way we could in an hour. But I'd recommend everybody read this book because it is that, if anything else, it kind of disturbs your way of thinking about your model railroad in a positive way, so that you can't look at it the same beyond that point in time. Where can they get the book, by the way?
It's on Amazon.com. If you just input my name and go to Amazon, you can get it.
Great. So back to the subject of balance. Maybe we can talk about that just a little bit, about how you achieve balance in a given scene.
Well, this is another example of where I would encourage the people that are watching this to go to your universities and really look into these composition courses, because what we're talking about and what I wrote in this book is absolutely, there is no difference between this and a painting. So if you go to an art course, everything we're talking about is going to be in an early composition course. But a couple of things that they talk about a lot in art is symmetry or balance. You have a central axis, you have things to the left and right. And a perfectly symmetrical scene, let's just take a grain bin. If you put a grain bin on each side of the central axis, it is balanced, but in the art world, that is considered over-symmetry. So, which brings visual boredom, and it just kind of subconsciously tunes you out. So there are different ways to add balance to a scene. You could have a grain silo, one grain bin on one side of the axis, and balance it out with two smaller ones on the other side. So then you have more visual interest, but it's still balanced. You can also balance things out by color. A dark object carries more visual weight than a light object. So if you had a large grain silo on one side of the axis and a smaller, darker one, it would be balanced. They would balance things out and still be interesting.
Yes.
And the challenge that we face is we're always fighting a battle of over-symmetry, because, and they talk a lot about this a lot in the art world, a chessboard would be overly symmetrical, but everything that we model, we're forced into that box. Urban areas are on a grid system, railroads are on a grid system, our bench work is straight, so we're always pushed into this situation of things looking overly symmetrical. But the one area that we do have some latitude, and I talked about this in my last newsletter, is vertically. So there are some things you can do in terms of breaking up the symmetry with the, utility poles, smokestacks, things of that nature. I mean, you have to execute them cleanly, but those are some ways you can break up the symmetry by going upwards.
Sure. Very nice. Do you have any examples of that you might be able to show us?
Let me just see if we can, I should get a flashlight, but, okay, can you see that, Kevin?
Yes. This is your N-scale Brooklyn terminal layout.
Right. So an example there would be how I position this stack. Can you see the smokestack?
Yes.
So it's just a little bit too boxy and too uniform with these warehouses. And so even though it didn't exist on the prototype, I added this stuff. So you can see how you've got symmetry there, and then I broke it up with the stack vertically.
Yes.
So that would be an example of that.
And I guess the objective here is, if you're viewing a particular scene, same as it would be for an artist, you want to draw the viewer in to that scene. And these are some of the ways that we can do it.
And let me address that for a second too, because, and I talked about this in the book, there is one difference, and I'm gonna go back to your comment. I wrote the book purely from a selfish standpoint, or the reader I wanted to be totally selfish, in that the viewer is the modeler. It's that one person. So everything we talk about is not so much about impressing your neighbors or fellow modelers, because, not to burst your bubble, people just really don't care that much about what we're doing. So everything that we talk about is an exercise in taking this hobby and making it more enjoyable for yourself. So that's really where I'm coming from with this. And with good art, the purpose is to move you, to evoke a positive feeling, transport you to a good place. And anything you can do to improve your modeling is just going to make the experience more enjoyable for yourself. So everything we're talking about the book is not so much me coming from high telling you do this or that. It's just saying that, we have this wonderful hobby, and these are some ideas which I encourage people to be totally ruthlessly selfish with the end game of just making it more enjoyable only for themselves.
Yes, yes, and that's fair. And that ties into something that we like to say a lot, and that is because we'll occasionally get questions. People call in and say, "Well, I've been told I can't do this, or I've been told I can't do that," and sometimes it's things that perhaps more serious modelers might say, "Well, yeah, that is kind of ridiculous," but you know what? Ultimately, we always tell the caller, whoever's inquiring, the same thing: whose model railroad is it? Whose layout is it? And generally, the answer, well, it's mine. That's right. So what makes you happy? And I think that's always what it's about, because this is about something that's it's meant to be a form of relaxation and enjoyment. And so you're right. Ultimately, the viewer that matters the most is you, because it's your layout, right?
But I will say that does not let you off the hook, because the more you put into it and the better job you do, likely the more you're going to enjoy it yourself.
True, absolutely. You mentioned something with with that stack not being prototypical, but that balances the scene out and helps break the scene out, the monotony of the other warehouses. And it occurred to me while you were saying that a big challenge I had in making strides on my the layout that I was building at my former house was that I grew up around the whole area that I was modeling, and I had to have everything prototypically correct, even to the point of um, printing 3D printing like a $400 water tower, because that was the kind they had next to the roundhouse at the South Hammond Yard. And it occurred to me while reading your book and while you're talking just there that's kind of a way for those of us who are strict prototype modelers could become imprisoned. And if we can do something that helps evoke that feeling, as you say, better, and helps break up the linear nature of the scene, and if we feel better about it, it may not be prototypical at all, like that smokestack, but ultimately, does that really matter? That got me to kind of release some things about, and you talk about this in your book about the layout of a town. Do you have to have everything that's in that town in there? Not really, because it might be too compressed, right?
Right.
So that can kind of be a way for those of us who are fairly strict prototype modelers to really imprison ourselves, and that's not fun.
And that comes with practice, and there is an art to it in terms of we don't have enough room, which in the end is a blessing. And it just comes with age and experience. What do you include? What do you not? I'm seeing more and more modelers, what I would call proto freelance, for the reasons that you just explained, in terms of it's very difficult to get where we want to go, given how large our prototype is compared to how little space we have. So that for many of us, it becomes an exercise in catching the feel or the flavor of that space. So the Los Angeles layout, which I just showed you, every structure that I panned through actually exists within 3 or 4 blocks of the area I model. But I kind of picked and choose and played around with the composition to get something that I personally liked. And the other thing too is that unless you pick a super famous place, nobody's going to notice. Right. I mean, even the most knowledgeable guy is not going to, they just can't, nobody's going to pick up on it.
Well, and I even questioned if someone who was familiar with it, but the scene was effective in evoking the feeling of that location,
Right.
then they wouldn't notice if there were 6 or 4 million windows, or if there was actually a round roof building in between those two flat roof buildings. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
If you get the essence of that location, then somebody who grew up there probably noticed it and not noticed that you're missing the second oil depot or whatever.
Right.
So that goes back to, it seems to me that this kind of is an outgrowth of, I think it was Alan McClellan with Virginia and Ohio back in the 60s and 70s, his concept of good enough, right? Because you could take it to the nth degree and just make sure that you have every nut, bolt, and washer casting exactly right, or you can evoke a sense of that particular place, whether it's real or imagined.
And you really hit the point of what I call like the 95-5 rule, in that with 5% of the effort, you can get yourself 95% of the way there. And you have to ask yourself, if it takes me 4 weekends to bring a scene to 95%, is it worth spending an extra 6 years to get the extra 5%?
Yes.
And the answer is probably not. So I think McClellan was right. And getting back to the book, the Ellison book, which I just bought, thanks for the recommendation. But
you found one. That's good.
I
They're
found
not
one.
easy. They're not easy to find.
But I would say Ellison would be one. So that was one huge step. And then the next step was McClellan. And I'm going to put Tony Custer in there, because
Absolutely.
McClellan would never would have been known if it hadn't been for Tony, which was one of the best, I think, in my opinion, one of the best writers and communicators ever.
Yeah.
So he was able to kind of get into McClellan's mind and write about it and
Yes.
communicate it. So I think that those were the two big launches to our hobby.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I have a couple other questions. Michelle, it looks like we don't have a lot of questions from our audience, right? Oops. Do I have you in the prison too? I'm sorry. I've got to find you here. Well, shoot. There's Michelle. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. Totally fine. We don't really have a lot of questions, but we do have some people commenting on things that really struck a point with them, Lance.
Okay. I'm going to leave you unmuted, and I've got a couple other questions for Lance, and we'll see. Again, folks, at the bottom of the screen, the bottom bar where it says chat, any question you might have for Lance, just type it in there, and Michelle will introduce it here in just a few moments. Lance, a couple more questions. One is, let's talk for a bit about what was my other question I wanted to ask you? It's getting dark in the room here. Oh, in your book you talk about backdrops,
Right,
and the role you see those playing. Maybe if you could talk about that for a bit, maybe some do's and don'ts, or what you see as perhaps better practices than others.
Well, I think the first thing with backdrops is to realize what a slippery slope they are, because it's something that the other art fields don't have to contend with. A painter who, the theory of painting or putting a two-dimensional piece of art together, which we've been talking about, a painter doesn't have to deal with it. We have a problem in that we are going from a three-dimensional layout surface and then 90 degrees something in 2 dimensions. And that's really difficult to handle effectively, because you're dealing with vanishing point issues, perspective issues. You can have, I guess the thing it's so easy to have a beautiful model and shoot yourself in the foot if you're not careful with the backdrops. And one way you can do it is, if you're like me and say, I'm just not that great a painter, I'm not going to overreach, and just keep it very, very subdued, because you don't want the backdrop to be the center of attention. You want the models that you just spent the last 3 years building to be where the focal point is. So the purpose of the backdrop is primarily to suggest atmosphere and distance, as Tony Custer puts it. So to that extent, you don't want to overreach. I'm not a big believer in hand painting because I can probably count on 3 fingers the number of model railroaders that are really artistic enough to pull that off. And if you can't, and it looks like a, an elementary school art project, all that work is going to be diminished. So the backdrop really should not be the center of attention. A couple ways you can handle it is just, a traditional sky blue with a, a very subtle gray horizon. That would do it. If you go with some of these new photo backdrops are very nice, particularly the ones with Appalachian trees, those work. But try to keep the central elements, if there's structures on it, small, maybe 2 to 3 inches, just to keep the perspective from getting out of control. So I think the first step is just to realize how problematic the transition is from layout to backdrop. That's the starting point.
Seems like we might be able to, between that that challenge, which is of course a challenge to go from 3D to 2D, and also we might be able to take a cue from theater here, where you don't want your backdrop, you don't want your scenery to upstage the players on the stage, right?
Right.
So simpler seems like it's probably better. Is that?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
So Michelle, we have a couple questions, 2 or 3. So let's take those now. How about that? Do I have you? Sorry, still in.
I'm mute. Okay, I don't know what happened.
Sorry.
There's actually 2 really good questions here, 3. So Lance, the question is from Ed, and he says, what is your advice on selective compression, i.e. to make something seem proto-sized, like say a number 12 turnout, or long siding represented by a number 6 or number 8, and just a 3-foot length of track? So it's a compression question.
I think you have to be realistic in that you're not going to use a number 12 on a 3-foot section of track. You're just going to have to go with a number 6. The one thing I would tell Ed is that often, given there's 2 ways you can handle things. You can crop or you can compress. You can take everything prototypical size and squeeze it together, in which case it looks very distorted, or you can make the difficult decision to eliminate things from the scene and crop them out. So you're better off doing a few things well, rather than trying to put too much into it. And ultimately, there is an art, and it comes with experience in terms of compressing. If you have a grain elevator with 20 silos, I mean, you can compress at the 8 or 10 and nobody's going to notice, but you do hit the point where it's too much. If you have 2 silos, it's going to look weird. So a lot of that just comes with experience.
Yeah.
So to tell Ed,
question.
Crop, not compressed.
Yeah.
Don't compress. Here's the second half of his question. Also, do you have any examples where forced perspective has been used effectively? I think he's asking on your layout.
I don't think it's that noticeable. There are examples where, let's say you had an HO scale layout with some depth and you could put some N scale structures in the distance. I don't see it as, I don't have any on my layout. I'm not sure it's a real game changer that much one way or the other. It's interesting, but I don't think it's something that really moves the needle that much.
Okay.
You know, one thing that's analogous that I noticed in your book, Lance, was that you mentioned it's best to always keep the width of roads, prototype width, going back away from the front. But you have where you have a T intersection and you have a structure behind against the backdrop. Those, right. The width of those roads is narrower than normal because the viewer doesn't know that that's not a full road. I thought that was a great example of how that's, in a way, that's forced perspective, I guess.
Yeah, as you look at a layout left to right on a shelf, we're very aware of the left to right width, but not the depth. So you can compress the depth and it's not as noticeable as the left to right.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good.
Okay, we have another question from Robert. Lance talks a lot about open space or non-railroad space. In fact, in all of his layouts, I have very few rail car spots. This is hard to do when you want to model train things. Can you talk about the issue of balancing that?
Well, I think it comes down to what you're trying to accomplish too, whether it's the visual or operational, because it's an individual hobby and nobody can tell you what aspect of it you enjoy. So if the chessboard game of chess operational aspect is more important to you than the visual, then you can't have anybody bully you into saying you should do it one way or the other. You need to follow what area of the hobby gives you the most enjoyment. So for the purpose of what we're talking about, it's purely visual. If the operational aspect is more important to you, then maybe the visual has to suffer.
Yeah, and I have a question for you.
Sure.
I haven't read your book, which I'm going to buy now because it sounds super interesting. Do you talk about like the rule of threes, like how your eye will travel from like three things in the visual that you're looking at?
I'm embarrassed because no, and I'm not the greatest student because they talked about that 2 or 3 times in all my classes and I forgot about it. So I'm not the perfect student.
Only thing I remember.
But
from
all I
art
can say is
class.
I should have, and it's important. And they talked about it in all my classes. But if they had given grades rather than pass fail, I probably would have gotten a C- for not knowing the rule of threes. But you are absolutely correct.
Well, there's 2 things, and someone put up a thing, rule of thirds. I'm talking about actually 2 different things in a way. The rule of thirds is often in photography, you know, a third, like you divide your screen, like if you're doing a horizon kind of thing, so that your eye sees the 3. But the rule of 3 that I was talking about is like something here, something over here, so that symmetry doesn't happen. So 2 different kind of things. But
I did not reach that level of sophistication in the book. But no, but it is a valid point, and it goes back to Michelle, where the benefit of going to these classes can be applied to what we're talking about, because those are the types of lessons that would improve your modeling. I've got to go back to class.
I have another question for you, Lance, and that is, let's talk. I'd like your perspective on, and we talked about this the other day, on mushroom layout design. Your take on that.
I would say that whenever, and this is just what I've seen throughout the hobby from all the people that I talk to, is I see so many people biting off more than they can chew, and leaving the hobby and not enjoying it because they overreach. So, and I'm going to throw double decks. The mushroom is probably as sophisticated as you can get. And I would say, if you have the skill level to pull it off and you jump into the project with absolute clarity in terms of how difficult it is, go for it. But if you aren't, you are opening yourself up to becoming overwhelmed with the complexity of that bench work. So to answer your question, it's a very valid way of doing things. It is very sophisticated, very complex, and I think it's out of reach for most people to achieve, including myself. So you have to be really careful getting into something like that.
Yes, yes. In fact, one of our callers, on this call is John Parker, and John's layout is a very, very well executed mushroom layout. And I'd love to hear from him at some point. Maybe John, you'd consider a future show, because just in trying to get my head around on CAD, get my head around what it takes to suspend the upper deck from the ceiling and to support the lower deck from down below, which you have a wall that's basically shaped like that. It's kind of hurting my head a little bit right now. So I'd love for us to be able to hear from someone who's done it effectively. Michelle, you said we had another one?
It was Chris. He had his hand raised.
Pardon?
Chris had his hand raised. Like,
Oh, Chris, I'm sorry. I didn't see your blue hand raised. I think let me see. Chris had his hand raised because he wanted me to let him out of mute jail. There you
How
go.
you doing?
There you go.
Real quick, Lance, in your opinion, what would be the best place to start for like an art class that would give you a good sort of launching point to some of the things that you were describing for, applied to layout and anything else?
That's an easy question. I would say composition.
Okay.
And I know at the Smithsonian Associates program, which is basically night school, the composition class was so well thought of that the students, in their input asked if they could stretch that out to 2 classes. So that's now 2 or 3 evenings where they spread the subject out. So to answer your question, it would be composition. At the Smithsonian, they also have another all-day course called visual literacy, where they just explain to you the elements of a painting, what some of the masters were trying to accomplish, what's going on with them. And there's just so many things happening that you're not aware of. That was an 8-hour course. It was so well done, it felt like it was an hour. So to answer your composition, visual literacy would be where I would focus.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fascinating concept. I mean, just the concept of, we're used to hearing about all kinds of literacy now, about emotional literacy and intellectual literacy and all types of other things. And the whole concept of visual literacy is fascinating. But I guess that would be what composition's about, right?
Right. Although the visual literacy kind of goes into a little more touchy-feely. Composition is only one portion of the visual literacy course. That is being offered again in September. If you go on Google and look up Smithsonian Associates, you'll get their course catalog. They're not that expensive. So if you were going to have a vacation in Washington, D.C., you could just wrap it around that one particular day for the course. It'd be a very enjoyable way to spend your vacation.
I was just in Chantilly, Virginia, not too long ago.
And Ed just put a link on the chat screen, so we have a link to Smithsonian Associates on there. And I'm laughing at let's see, it was yours, Michelle, and back to our comments on the mushroom. Ed and Michelle both said that they had gotten lost in John's mushroom layout, and I've been there, and I've been there myself. I understand. I went down a couple blind alleys trying to find my train, basically. And John did say, and John's the one that built this layout, and this says, yes, it's hard to conceptualize the mushroom concept. I agree with Lance's comments. So if it's hard to conceptualize for somebody who's built one, I think that says a lot right there.
And I'm not putting it down. I'm just saying that just know what you're getting into. Momentum is very very important. So if you're a modeler that's got 15 or 20 years experience and you really know, and you're really trying to move things to the next level and you understand it, then maybe that's for you. But if you haven't built that many layouts and you're 3 or 4 years in a hobby, maybe you should get some simpler successes under your belt first. That's all I'm saying.
Well, and as we discussed the other day, we're kind of seeing a balance between a large, ambitious layout. It may be multi-deck. That is the good enough, right? Where there's not a high degree of detail to a lot of things, but the whole scene is evocative of a particular scene somewhere. And smaller, maybe spare bedroom size layouts that have a much higher level of detail. And Chris had mentioned earlier that track's a model too, and we tend we tend to not think of it that way. You see this really exquisitely detailed locomotive and boxcar on what appears to be an outgrowth of train track, or train set track, as opposed to viewing that track as a Model 2. So it seems that there's a balance to be struck between what, as you say, biting off more than you can chew, or doing something that you want to achieve in a way that you want to achieve it. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think also it's coming to a degree of self-acceptance in terms of what areas are most enjoyable to you. So if the track work, with this Proto 87 and their etched parts, you can take that to really an unbelievable level. But the reality is, if you go to that level of detail, you're not going to have a 50 by 50 foot layout.
Yes.
And maybe that's okay. If that's where your enjoyment comes from, what's wrong with having, a 6 square foot layout with that level of detail in it?
Right.
If it brings enjoyment to you. So it's just a matter of what you personally find enjoyable and rewarding.
Well, and as I think Tony Custer had said at one point, there's also the factor of planning an ambitious layout and then considering how many years in the hobby we might have left, because there's only so much you can do with a like you say, a 50 by 50 layout. That's a long-term project.
And it doesn't have to be all or nothing either, Kevin, because you could, just take something the size of, say, what Tony has, maybe just single deck. You could do the Atlas, but there's nothing to keep you from having one small scene that maybe you want to spend 2 or 3 months really detailing. So
Yes.
You could have a mix of the more generic and then, mix in something highly detailed. It doesn't have to be all one or the other either.
Yes, good point. Well, we're coming up on our time here. Is there anything interesting that you could talk about what you're working on right now for clients?
We've got some interesting ones. This all goes back to what you and I were talking about as far as, I think a lot of it comes back to just having pleasant memories and wanting to recreate it. And the people that call me, they've had things they've grown up with that just have always been kind of the feel-good place in their mind that they want miniatures of. Right now I'm working on the Pullman Junction and south side of Chicago.
Yes.
That's almost done. So that was a lot of fun.
Yes, looks like it. I love that photo of that Versen building, that tool building. That's such a hallmark for Pullman Junction, and your model's exquisite. It's really a nice rendition of that.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? It looks like we're pretty much out of questions, and first of all, Lance, I'd like to thank you for participating with us on our inaugural call. Thank you very much for being here. And speaking of Model Railroad as Art, join us this same time Tuesday evening next week when we visit Gerald Stiles' amazing ON30 Termite and Tarantula Railroad. Gerald's our creative director and I'm sorry, Gerald, your title is creative dude. Our creative dude at Caboose. And Gerald has Gerald does some very, very fun things with automation, and I'll just leave it at that and say just watch for the prairie dogs in next week's installment because he's automated prairie dogs, which I think is pretty cool. So that's next week, next Tuesday, 6:30 Mountain Time, 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 Pacific. Anybody have anything else? Michelle? Chris?
On Saturday night, I was just going to do kind of a free-for-all. What are you working on here on the same call? If anybody wants to do that, maybe raise your hand if you're interested. It's truly just, I called it Social Saturday when I suggested it.
Yeah, that's when I decided I'd want to have a beer, and I'm going to call it happy.
Yeah. You can bring a beer. It's okay.
Right.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Kevin. I appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you, Lance. We appreciate it.